All right, welcome to the S3 study group run by the Odin community. Today's October 22nd, Tuesday, 2024. And today we have Randall presenting the principle of equivalence.
Thanks, Nori.
Mhm.
In S3, one of the ways that we're guided to operate is based on principles. And by holding a number of principles in mind as we do our work, we can use them as a guide for how we do that work. And there are other guides for how we may do that work that we'll see in other areas of the way we define domains. But the idea of principles in S3 is that they can cut across all aspects of an organization and provide that perspective that helps people all come from a similar stance. Today's principle is about equivalence. And I chose this one because of all the S3 principles. It's the one that doesn't look on its surface the way it is under the surface. The difficulty with, of course, expressing principles as one word or even two or three words is that the words are not the content. And this principle shows it more than any other. Let's get into it. When we say equivalence, what does it mean? Does it mean equal? Does it mean everybody is the same? Does it mean that everybody has equality, that they're going to earn the same amount from the time that they spend? Or does it mean something else entirely? Let's find out. At a high level, when we read the surprisingly detailed material, which you can find on the Sociocracy Patterns website about equivalence, what we see is that there's very little about people being equal in the principle of equivalence. In a sense, the idea of equivalence is all about getting a good enough result, which is super counterintuitive versus the word equivalence, which is why it was so interesting to me. At a high level, the idea here is that many people can have an opinion, but many people are going to have some overlapping opinions, and you may not get any more value from involving a whole lot of people. You may well get diminishing returns or negative returns from the chaos of involving too many people that aren't having valuable, incremental things to add to any particular decision. On the other hand, you do need to have enough. The guiding factor here is get a good enough result. Another perspective on that is to use representatives. And whether you're talking about representative governance or whether you're talking about having enough of a perspective on people who are not part of the organization, but whose input the organization needs to do its good enough result, we can use representation to show enough of that stance that the stakeholders would have. If you involve 4 people and 2 of them have plenty of the perspective, then those other 2 people aren't necessarily adding value. And even if you have one trustee from a group of people who have trust within themselves, that one person can bring much more efficiency than 4 would when they are combined in a group with multiple trustees in a collaborative or influence setting. Nora, does that make any sense? I'm curious if any questions come up for you about this slide.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And I like to show enough of a stakeholder stance. And Yeah, I think it's a good definition of what we're talking about here.
Sweet. One of the questions that comes up on the expansion of the principle of equivalence is the question, who is needed? Having the right audiences, having the perspective of the right audiences is a critical factor in being able to be an effective organization. Of course, this is not only about good collaboration, it's also about good choices. And getting a good enough result means that you made a choice that's good enough because it had enough of a multifaceted perspective on the problem and the impact of that problem. Market research being a kind of a classic case, and it's valuable because it's so impactful and not easy to do. And so I think it could be easy to gloss over this idea and saying, oh, get the right perspective, and show up with a stance that it's easy to get enough of the right perspective. It's not always easy to get that good enough, sufficient perspective, but it is very valuable. And you may have to do extra work to get it. And there is a cross connection to another principle of empiricism, where you may not be able to get all the right perspective all at once. You may have to do some experimentation and find out from those 400 people a little bit more signal than you could expect to get in collaboration with 400 people, maybe by rolling out simple experiments and measuring results. It's funny that should come up when we're talking about a principle of equivalence. Again, back to the conflict between a simple name and a complicated idea. Maybe there is no equivalence. Maybe the essence of the principle of equivalence is that people are not equivalent, that everyone brings something unique to the table. And we need to get the right input from enough of them. One of the perspectives about equivalence is that we can invest in learning to bring the people that we have who are not equivalent into alignment as far as skills and as far as having a baseline shared set of skills, particularly for collaborating together and on the various many habits and patterns of S3, and bring people more toward being equivalent in their behaviors, not to be equivalent as individuals, but to share those habits that make them effective and efficient when they're collaborating, when they're wayfinding, when they're choice making. And we can't always know everything. When we're trying to make a good enough decision, the final point here on this presentation is really about recognizing when you may not have the right expertise, when the thing that you need is really something that you need to bring in from external. And maybe it's in the way of hiring an expert, or maybe it's in the way of doing some market research, bringing in those external people who can give that unique perspective because they are not equivalent to us. It can be very valuable to bring all the right material for us to, what was the goal? To get a good enough result. What comes up for you, Nori?
For me, yeah, like if you think of everyone having the same skills and perspective and experience, that's not true. But For me, equivalence is about everyone being peers in the decision-making process. It's like we're talking about, it's kind of, for me, it's code for there are no managers, bosses, or people that are making decisions for you and telling you what to do. You get to participate in the decision-making process, whatever that looks like. And everyone has a voice if they choose to offer that up.
Another way to say that might be that no one is less equal.
Mhm.
There's maybe a point of conflict between what you said and some of the ideas around having enough of the right perspective. The sociocracy material on this pattern talks about balancing equivalence with efficiency or effectiveness. It would suck to be part of an organization that says you don't matter because we have enough perspective already.
Mhm. But to turn that around, I would say it would be great to be able to consent to delegate certain spheres of responsibility to circles or subcircles and trust that they got it. And that they only need to talk to me if they know that I'm a direct stakeholder or the decision will impact me. But otherwise, I've delegated that responsibility. And that was part of my equivalence decision-making kind of power, was to delegate. It wasn't, it's like, there's that concept as well in there, I think, that you have the power to delegate responsibility if needed or desired. And that's not taking away from equivalence. It's actually part of that effectiveness, is how do we not involve everybody in every decision if that's not what they want.
Yeah, and you can refer to it as delegating responsibility. Sometimes the word trustee arises, and that's just a form of, like, you're sending a delegate. You're saying, I trust you, or we as a working group made the consensual choice to send one person, or maybe we chose to send two as our trustees. Yeah, that's definitely a case of balancing efficiency with or effectiveness, I should probably have written,
Mhm.
with the idea of everybody being able to have a voice. Another way that it occurs to me it'd be nice to be part of an organization would be that when you sent that delegate and they go and do their thing, that it's not in secret, and that you may be able to have enough transparency to know that the concerns that come from the group that delegated that authority are represented.
Mhm. I think that's another one of those value words, is transparency. I think you need that for equivalence to work properly. People need to know what decisions are being made and how. And
Turns out transparency is one of the S3 principles.
mhm.
Consent, effectiveness, empiricism, continuous improvement, equivalence, transparency, and accountability.
Mhm.
I wonder how much these other principles would expand to their own presentations, or how much they may fit into a single denser presentation. But it felt to me like the principle of equivalence was tricky enough to warrant its own segment.
No, I agree. There's a lot of juice here around what it means, and it's one of those principles that goes against the traditional grain of how we set up organizations in the past, with hierarchy and spheres of responsibility and that kind of stuff, command and control hierarchies. And I think equivalence helps us tear that down and create a much more or totally flat organization of peers. And then S3 sets up all the patterns within equivalence to make it work, like consent-based decision making, transparency, things like that.
My natural contrariness makes me consider that in many organizations that are run along the lines that you describe, there are people who, maybe even many people, depending on the organization and its culture, who work to get this because it's all about getting a good result. And that when you include enough of the right perspective, you get a better result. But that's down to culture as opposed to, I guess it's down to culture and sociocracy as well, but it may be more explicit when you have it as like a formal adopted principle of the organizational style. It's a beautiful thing when you're part of an organization in which people have habits of acting that way.
Yeah. I think that's the beauty of this is if you're results oriented, then this should get better results because you have more input, more diverse kind of participation in decision making. If you're more interested in making sure everyone's voice is heard and that people are happy with where they're working and how they're interacting, then it enables that as well. So it hits on many different value sets, which I think is essential when you're working, especially in the decentralized groups that we're in. Like, we all come from different backgrounds, and we should probably find patterns of working together that work for everybody, and not just like, if you're this kind of person, this is a really good system. But I can see this being pretty broadly applicable once you lean into that. If there's no manager, no boss, no CEO, then what do we do? How do we make decisions? And this gives us a very reasonable pathway to achieve some good effectiveness through equivalence, but also all the other values kind of lean in and enhance all of this. I think they all work together really well.
It's easy to look at a statement like, we want to have everyone's voice, and see that as naive. And if it's taken all on its own to amplify that last statement that you made, it doesn't really stand on its own. But together with all of the other principles and patterns, it becomes a very, I think it enables a very effective dynamic because the different patterns support each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then adding a dash of efficiency to the practice of equivalence gets enough of the voices heard without the inefficiency that one might think, oh, naively, you're trying to get everyone's voice, and that's not possible.
Mm-hmm.
But then you mix empiricism in, and you bring in outside expertise, and you add these other principles and practices. And when you consider all of them together in a complete picture, you start to, what I've observed is that picture forms up in a way that looks like a really good performing organization of any kind, And it just so happens that it's a form of organization that could exist in a way that is not necessarily very hierarchical.
Mhm.
Any last things you think we should add? I've already taken a note of adding one item on the slide deck.
We covered delegation, transparency, consent, peer-to-peer kind of stuff. Yeah, I think. Yeah, there's a lot here, and it's one of the top-level values, I guess, or principles of S3. So, yeah, a lot of patterns themselves fit under this to help support equivalence, and I think it's great to zoom out to that and talk about it, because there's a lot of good stuff when you like why empiricism and or why equivalence, and that kind of makes you think about like all the things that go into it and why that's there. Um, and I know S3 wasn't made for like blockchain, decentralized DAO kind of governance, but it fits so well with the kind of community that we just have by default that I think these are really great patterns to look at and lean into and explore.
Beautiful.
Any wrapping thoughts from you?
The map is not the landscape. It continues to apply here when we look at the shape of the description. It does not do more than very roughly approximate the experience, and the experience of applying principles and patterns in sociocracy is really the thing. And that's my parting thought.
Awesome. Thank you for presenting this today, Randall.
My pleasure.